Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. We are back. Today is Wednesday, February 2026. It's been a while since Josiah and I have been able to do a podcast episode together. My name is Sebastian, in case you forgot, and my co-host is Josiah. You've probably seen us in some special episodes that we've done together. Hi, Josiah. How are you?
I'm good. I've missed you, Sebastian. It feels like we haven't had one of these conversations in a very long time.
Yeah, man. Happy New Year in February. It's never too late. I think you can say it through the end of February. Happy New Year. It's good seeing you, brother. We just spent a couple of days actually in DC with the rest of the team. I hope everybody who's listening to this is staying warm because it's freezing pretty much everywhere except Florida. So, or even Florida, the iguanas are falling off the trees.
I
So
know.
today,
I saw something about that. Yeah, they're like, bring them into your local wildlife center or whatever. They're trying to figure out what to do with all the iguanas that are just all over the ground because the poor guys, they just fall out of the trees because they're stunned by the cold.
yeah, my in-laws live in Florida. And he has a picture with the iguanas hanging off the tail, like because they're just paralyzed. It's really funny.
Mm.
Besides iguana news today, we're going to try to catch up about the biggest headlines. Feels like a lot has been happening ever since the year started. It was just one big thing after another. So we're gonna try to catch up with what we think are the biggest headlines that each of us think we should discuss. And tied to that, we'll discuss many other things that are related because, of course, everything's connected when it comes to Israel, the Middle East, United States. So each of us will share our top story. I'm going to get started, and then Josiah will tell you guys. I'm going to tease it, and it's about Iran. So if you're thinking a lot about Iran, and trust me, I wake up every day and I just go to Times of Israel, like, okay, did they attack? Did they attack? I'm just constantly checking to see if the attack has happened. So if you're interested about Iran, if you're thinking a lot about Iran, as I have been doing, stay with us because Josiah is going to touch all about that. He's going to tell us about the current situation in Iran and what is probably going to happen in the next few weeks, or maybe not. We don't know. But if you listen to the episode from last week, I started that episode by acknowledging that the last hostage body had been found. And many people have phrased this as, oh, they're all home. And yes, in a way, he's home. Of course, he's not with us. He was murdered. Ran Givli was returned home. Just correct me here, because I saw a beautiful video of the soldiers gathering around when they found his body. They sing a song. And I think they found him in his uniform, on his soldier's uniform, right?
That detail, I don't know. I'm sorry, but
Okay.
it was a very powerful video of the soldiers singing during his return.
Yeah, that's what I heard. I'll give it credit to the Times of Israel Daily podcast where they talked about this, and his sister became very prominent as she was advocating for the return of him. And for many people, like even members of the United States administration, they were getting impatient. Like, okay, move on. Let's move on to the next stage. But Israelis were very adamant that we cannot move on until the last hostage is brought home. And this is a significant moment because this means that for the first time since 2014, there are no more Israeli hostages in Gaza, and that's a big deal. Many of us, Passages alumni, we all have visited communities near the border with Gaza, like Natif Hazara and others, and you'll see the faces of those three hostages that were captured in 2014. Well, they have been returned home in one way or another, and all the other hostages were returned as well. So if you guys remember, the Times of Israel, for instance, was tracking how many days we've been at war. They took that down, which is interesting. So we're no longer at war. But Josiah, it doesn't feel like it, does it?
No, it's weird. I mean, I think that there's probably two reasons why it doesn't feel like the war is over. One, because you still have these daily reports coming out about skirmishes in Gaza or Lebanon or something like that. So the fighting is not over. You also have this weird specter of what may or may not become a broader regional conflict again with Iran, which we'll get to that in a moment. But I think the sense of finality that people are feeling is not so much that, all of Israel's enemies have been vanquished and that there is a, everlasting peace is going to be what follows next. Rather, I think people are just taking down the posters or some of the clocks, the clock in
Yeah.
Hostage Square, for example, because they're just so relieved that the hostages are home. That in and of itself is a moment of significant closure, even though there's still a lot of uncertainty about what comes next and how long is the fighting going to continue, or will it get worse or not. I mean, there's a lot we don't know yet, but there is a very palpable sense of relief that at the very
Yeah.
least, the hostages are home.
Yeah, and I saw a beautiful video. I think it was a Jewish agency who produced it of people taking off their dog tags, I guess, for bringing
Mhm,
them home, or their pin, or the picture of the last hostage, like off their office door or something. I personally, we had an event here in Atlanta the week before his body was found, and I was wearing my yellow pin, and people asked me, "Why are you still wearing that?" I was like, "Well, because there's still one more, and we cannot forget about this last one." So now, no longer wearing it because the last hostage has been brought home, and may no other Israeli ever be kidnapped again. So I want to touch on some things that I related to this. So obviously, 844 days of war is way longer than I personally anticipated. I think many people anticipated that this war would go on. I remember when it started, I was like, okay, this will probably will go on for a few weeks. But as
mhm,
the war, we started realizing what actually had happened and how many people were murdered, how many people were kidnapped. We started realizing this is going to be a few months, then a year, then 2 years. So, it's going to be 3 years this October. So it was a long war. And I think for Israelis, it's especially meaningful. So as Christians, I think we should pray that the Lord will comfort them. We should rejoice with them. It's really, like you said, Josiah, Hostage Square was a weekly rhythm in Israeli life. Thousands of people would turn out. They would have speeches, songs, demonstrations, really creative demonstrations to call attention, appeals to President Trump, especially, who became like
mhm,
their go-to person to please make a deal to bring them home. And now that's been dismantled, and they had their last like Shabbat, end of Shabbat ceremony there, and the Hostage Square is no longer an active place of reunion. I'm sure we'll continue to visit there just as a reminder. So I want to touch on a few things that related to this. So the last hostage is home, but there's a lot that we still need to talk about in Gaza. For instance, let us acknowledge that after 2+ years of war, an outcome of this war has been the weakening of Israel's enemies. So Hamas
mhm,
has been pretty much dismantled. All there is left of Hamas is, and Josiah, you can push back here, all their top leaders were murdered. All the top leaders were assassinated. A lot of their forces were disintegrated. Their top leaders are no longer here. Of course, they've been replaced for some people. There's still some people abroad. But as a fighting force, Hamas is down to basically a guerrilla. I think they used to be like a standing army in a way. Now they're a guerrilla. As you mentioned, Josiah, even last night or yesterday, some terrorists came out of a tunnel and attacked a IDF unit. So they're still there, and they're still wanting to continue up running Gaza. But Hamas has been weakened. I'll take it to you in a second after my summary. Hezbollah has been weakened a lot, as we know. Uh, and one of the biggest proofs of this is that when Israel was attacking Iran during the 12-day war, Hezbollah stayed out of it. And that was Iran's whole backup plan, like or insurance policy, that Israel would not attack Iran because Iran would activate Hezbollah against Israel, and Hezbollah stay out of it. So
mhm,
Israel continues to operate in Lebanon, continues to do surgical operations to remove threats in Lebanon. Syria, as we know, the Bashar al-Assad regime is gone. There's a new guy in town, and that's a whole interesting subject. But Syria is at the moment not a huge threat to Israel. And then Iran. Iran was weakened. Their air defenses were destroyed by Israel. The echelons of their military were destroyed. Top scientists were destroyed. Nuclear scientists who were building a death bomb to annihilate Israelis. So Israel's enemies have been weakened, and I think that's one of the consequences of this war, that we need to praise the Lord that October 7th, Israel was surrounded by enemies and was in a really precarious situation. The danger is still there. Iran is still a problem, but Israel enemies have been weakened. Any quick thoughts you have about this item, Josiah?
Yeah, I think to your point, the conflict is ongoing, but has shifted into a new phase and has evolved somewhat over the last few weeks, couple of months, really since the ceasefire started. So I think you do have something to be optimistic about. I think in my mind, it's not that there is so much to be pessimistic about, but that there are a lot of question marks. Quickly can some of these wins be solidified and packaged together in such a way that they can produce some lasting and sustainable outcomes Or is it going to take too long and things will eventually spiral again and another round of conflict will begin? Because it's considered inevitable that at some point there's going to be more conflict, whether that's with Hamas or with Hezbollah is kind of a question mark. They're still trying to give the Lebanese army a chance to disarm Hezbollah, but if they can't, then Hezbollah, Iran, definitely there's enough left over after the war last summer that eventually there will be another round of conflict. So the question is really when, not if. And in the meantime, can these wins that have been produced be stacked together in such a way that they ensure a positive outcome the next time that there is a round of fighting? Because unfortunately, that's just kind of the nature of the beast or a reality in the Middle East right now is that a win now doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be another round of fighting in the future. There almost definitely will be. And it's all about how you spend your time between now and then, if that makes sense. So, yeah, again, to your point, Sebastian, there's so much to be grateful for and so much to just give God praise for the evil that has been punished pretty significantly over the last couple of years. But I think there's also a need to be forward thinking and mindful about ways that we can still be praying for the future peace and safety of the Middle East as well.
Right. So let us keep praying for that, for Israel's enemies who are still obsessed with destroying the Jewish people. Another thing I wanted to mention related to this is what I will call a ceasefire on campus. So far, right now, students have returned to campus, and we have not seen the encampments and the obsession, the craziness that was going on with anti-Israel demonstrations on campus. There still will be anti-Israel events and accusations of genocide and so on. But I think because the war has died down and Israel is not actively, fighting a war there every day, then things on campus will calm down. As we know, domestically, people are now turning their attention to things like ICE, deportations, things like that. So, however, I wanted to mention that what they should be protesting about and what they should be shutting down these campuses about is Iran. Islamic regime that hates women, that hates minorities, that oppresses people, and allegedly has killed at least 5,000 or upwards of 30,000 people. I even saw an Israeli Iranian activists claiming that it was something like 80,000 people. We don't know. We don't know how many people have been murdered by this regime who literally, allegedly, you'll tell us about it. But let's wait for Josiah. So you can tell Josiah what I wanted to mention is who is doing the killing? Who's doing the shooting? Are they Iranians or who are they? So ceasefire on campus, that's something else to be grateful for. Let me hit two quick ones and then we'll go to Josiah to tell us about Iran. Israel's diplomatic standing. So even though Israel has been victorious against its enemies that surrounded, Israel's diplomatic standing around the world was really weakened and really damaged by this war. Its relationships with key Western nations like the United Kingdom or France, Spain, even the United States, diplomatic relationships were really damaged, unfortunately, because I think of the weak leadership and the domestic pandering to anti Semitic waves on their countries. When Israel was attacked on
Mhm.
October 7th, a lot of these countries expressed sympathy, but that sympathy quickly waned. And within months, they were attacking Israel and demanding a ceasefire, accusing Israel of genocide. Netanyahu is technically a wanted man in some of these countries because of arrest warrant that was put out against him. So that leads me to think about the Board of Peace. So President Trump has launched a Gaza Board of Peace. It's a very interesting situation. It was supposed to be just about Gaza, but its documents leave it broad enough that they could move on to deal with other conflicts around the world. As we know, the
Mhm.
president has been really growing into this role of like the peacemaker who wants to be involved in bringing conflict resolution around the world. So, just really
Mhm.
quick, the board is that he is the president of this board for life. Members can pay $1 billion and they get some privileged state countries are the only ones who are allowed to be part of it. The head of state is the person who represents. They get to be on it for 3 years terms, and Trump has a veto power on anything. Every nation gets a vote. And of course, one of the concerning things is that on this board, there are people like Pakistan or countries like Pakistan, Turkey, Russia, countries that are not who do not have Israel's best interests at hand. So the Board of Peace is happening. So that's something else. And then the last thing, which is related, Josiah, and I'm going to send it to you for comment, is the day after for Gaza. So Gaza is going to be governed by a technocratic committee, and there is some controversy surrounding this. For instance, the committee decided to use as its logo basically a copy paste of the Palestinian Authority logo. And for Israelis, this is very hurtful, very painful that Israelis were attacked by Hamas and Israel was able to defend, attack, decimate Hamas. And now they're going to get the PA kind of as an alternative there. in Gaza. And I'm sure for many Israelis, the PA is better than Hamas, but for many Israelis, that's a non-starter. So this technocratic committee is going to start governing Gaza. The big question here is, will Hamas disarm? They have not disarmed and they're unwilling to disarm. I even read a comment from one of Hamas official last week saying like, we never promised to disarm. That was never part of the deal. But it was in writing in the deal that they signed. Rafah is the border crossing between Gaza and Egypt has been reopened in a pilot program. If you guys remember, all eyes on Rafah, this is a very contentious point because since Israel did not used to control that crossing, it was controlled by Egypt. A lot of weapons would be smuggled this way. So now Israel is there, and they started a pilot where only people can cross. And there's a quota. There's a limit of 50 people per day right now. And on the first day, something like 14 people were able to cross. So when people cross, Israelis are involved in checking them, in questioning them, making sure that they're not terrorists, and it's just for people right now. So that was a lot. Before I send it to you, I just want to mention one thing. The reason why this matters, for instance, the IDF found yesterday, and they put a video that you can find where in some UNRWA aid, they found a bunch of weapons and rockets and mortars. So this is the issue, that in the disguise of humanitarian aid and aid for Palestinian people in Gaza, a lot of weapons are smuggled this way. And Israel did not just fight a 2-year war to let Hamas rearm themselves and be back in war in a year or two again. My whole point here, why this is a tough story, is because thank God the hostages are home, but the day after for Gaza starts now. And there is a lot of challenges to deal with. But with that, Josiah, I would love for you to make any comments that you want to elaborate on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about the Board of Peace and the day after in Gaza situation is, as you've laid out, Sebastian, there's a lot of concerns and questions, of course, about how is this going to work. And what fascinates me about it is that you haven't really seen any lack of confidence from the U.S. administration that it can work. What that communicates, however, is that it really is up to the U.S. administration to sort of be the enforcer. And that can take various forms. Either that means that it directly enforces the terms of the agreement itself, or that it empowers someone else to do so and then holds them accountable to do so, whether that is this sort of technocratic committee of Palestinians or a reformed Palestinian Authority, whether that's Israel potentially. At the end of the day, though, I think that the primary takeaway is not that this system can't work. Rather, that the only way that it works is if the U.S. holds each of the different partners that it has invited into the process fully accountable for the role that they're supposed to play. Because if it doesn't hold the Palestinian Authority accountable, or frankly, if it doesn't hold Israel accountable in the ways that it needs to, it's not going to work. It will fail unless everyone agrees to play their part and is required to do so and held fully accountable to that end. I think it is just going to be absolutely fascinating. The biggest question in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's minds, is Hamas isn't going to voluntarily disarm. So are the other players involved capable of or willing to accept the costs of forcing it to happen? If you listen at some of the recent remarks made by different members of the U.S. administration or different representatives, like Jared Kushner, for example, the U.S. commitment to the disarming of Hamas has not decreased at all. If anything, it's even more firm in light of recent criticisms and in response to recent criticisms. So that's a good thing. I think a good sign, because it has to happen in order for any day after in Gaza to be peaceful and to work. But it still begs the question: okay, who, how is it going to happen? Who's going to make it happen? And I think it's just going to be fascinating. I mean, if there's one thing about Gaza, I think it's going to be most fascinating to observe over the next several months. It's really that. I also think it'll be really interesting to see, to your point, Sebastian, yes, things have quieted down in terms of a lot of the attention and the criticism and all of that. One thing that hasn't necessarily happened, though, because it is still kind of half a war zone, half not in Gaza, is there hasn't been a ton of international coverage. One thing that is starting to happen a little bit more, though, is you're starting to hear more stories coming out with reporting on or footage of, photos of Gaza after 2 years of war. And it's shocking. I mean, I shouldn't say shocking necessarily, because I think everyone should have known that it was going to be pretty significant, the damage that was done to the Gaza Strip. I think, if anything, has the the possibility of sort of reigniting those debates on college campuses, it's going to be when people see the images, because people haven't been seeing images for a little while now. But at some point, I think once the rebuilding process starts, the media coverage of the rebuilding process is going to remind everyone how much damage was done in Gaza. And then that debate will likely reignite, and that all the questions about, why so much damage? Why so much military activity in civilian areas? Did Hamas instigate, or did Israel instigate these questions, or these specific battles? And that's a big issue. I think that's part of why, since the first day of this war, or even before the war began, there were these accusations of genocide. But within the first couple of weeks after Israel actually invaded Gaza, you already had these sort of debates raging on college campuses and in the American media. And I think, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but I think those debates are likely to sort of resurface when the rebuilding process starts, and then reporters start to once again sort of dig into what the damage was, what they're trying to put back together in Gaza, if that makes sense. So those are my thoughts, Sebastian.
That, like I said, it's been a while, so we had a lot of catching up to do. So thank you, Josiah, for that. If you guys have any questions about the current situation in Gaza, anything specific that you guys want to cover, please let us know in the comments. We'd love to interact with you that way. So now, Josiah, the next big thing is actually what's truly top of my mind all the time is Iran. And
Mm.
I'll just tee you up by saying I really don't want to live to regret looking back into history and saying we, the United States, could have done something historic here and we missed the opportunity. And Iran is still the same. Tell us what's going on in Iran.
You know, it's really quite difficult, I think, to answer that question. And I'll say a couple things before I answer your question, Sebastian. Number one, I chose this when we were discussing what we wanted to cover in this podcast episode. I chose this as sort of my top story of the last 6 weeks since you and I last spoke, not because the situation in Gaza is unimportant or because the return of that last hostage is not very significant, but because we couldn't both pick the same top stories. So I picked a different one, which is Iran, which is also, I think, a very big story just because of the big picture implications for US foreign policy, even beyond Israel. I think there's a lot there that's really important to unpack. I also think we don't have time to fully rehash everything that happened during the early weeks of the protest. If you want to do that, if to those listening, I would highly encourage you to go back to, there's a special episode with Jonathan from the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. He's an Iran analyst who was actually born in Tehran, so he has a lot of insight into the protest movements of the thousands of and in the most recent round of protests in terms of what happened. The challenge in answering your question, Sebastian, about what's going on there is that there's still an internet blackout. And one of the things that I think was one of the more underrated storylines, but a really critical turning point in the protest is that Starlink, which was sent basically to help the protesters stay online, keep the internet online, and circumvent the regime's oppression or attempt to impose a blackout, was also more or less taken offline by the regime. It's supposed to be kind of capable of working around these different oppression measures or blackout measures, and it couldn't. The regime found a way somehow to take down Starlink and once again drastically reduce access to internet and cell communications. So that's put us in a position where it is pretty hard to say what's going on there. I think you already alluded to some pretty crazy variances in terms of numbers people report. I think the numbers that I'm most frequently hearing from a lot of people analyzing the situation in Iran is somewhere in the couple tens of thousands of people died in the crackdown on the protesters. So yeah, to call it 20 to 30 is kind of an estimate that I hear pretty often. But again, this is coming out from different human rights groups or dissident groups or whatnot, but it's not like there's an official number out there that is being published, or it's very difficult to get really good information and precise numbers because of this internet blackout. So frankly, it's just a really screwed up situation. It's very hard to know what's going on there exactly. I think if we take a step back and think about, okay, what are the developments, not just between the protesters and the regime, but the way that the rest of the world is reacting to or responding to what's going on in Iran. There, I think, obviously, there's a lot more transparency, information available, if you will, and some really interesting things that I think we should talk about for a few minutes. So I'll just run through a list of some of my highlights in that respect, Sebastian. I think that the protests, unfortunately, have been largely crushed. It doesn't seem like there is the same scale of protest happening that happened during the early weeks of the protests. There are still reports of small protests, but nothing like what was happening during the first few weeks because they were crushed by the response, the number of people killed in response to those protests. Instead, what you're hearing is a lot of back and forth, not between the protesters and the regime, but between the U.S. administration and the regime, for example. So, while the protests were still very strong, President Trump was encouraging them by saying things like, "We will have your back. We will support you. If the regime starts shooting at or attacking protesters, we will get involved in some capacity." The US administration did not immediately do that. It's unclear exactly why. I think there's a couple of theories. One being that there were different allies that asked the United States not to. The other being that President Trump was worried about the costs of doing so before there was enough military hardware in the Middle East to carry out some significant operation. Because to be fair, we don't always have enough pieces in the Middle East to carry out massive strikes on Iran. A lot of the military hardware that he needed was elsewhere in the Caribbean, participating in the Venezuela operation, for example, or in the Pacific, patrolling South China Sea areas. So there has been a lot of movement of military hardware, which does suggest that perhaps that's at least part of the reason why there hasn't been any military action to this point is because they wanted to move some pieces around the chessboard. And it takes a few weeks to move some of those pieces, like an aircraft carrier. It doesn't move fast across the world. It takes time for that to happen. There's probably something to that, but there's still quite a bit of ambiguity, I think. Currently, there are negotiations scheduled for later this week. The US demands are very extensive. So, this I think is also very interesting that the last time there was this call for negotiations, it was prior to the US airstrikes against Iran in the 12-day war last summer against the nuclear program. And then shortly after, there was a resumed call for negotiations to follow. But the focus last summer of the negotiations was really Iran's nuclear program. And that was also the focus of US military airstrikes in Iran was primarily the nuclear program. This time around, Steve Witkoff came out and basically staked out a negotiating position for the United States, which was you have to end the nuclear program, you have to end the ballistic missile program, and you have to end your regional proxy network and support for terrorism across the Middle East. I mean, the demands of the Iranian regime are so much higher now than they were last summer. It's really quite interesting. I think if you look at things like Iranian newspapers, the reaction has been pretty extreme belligerence. We don't care. If, in Trump's words, he sent an armada to the Middle East, and Iran's reaction is, we don't care, basically daring President Trump to do something or to actually use all of those different pieces that he has at his disposal now in the Middle East, or arguing that they will find some way to respond, that it'll start a regional war that the U.S. can't win, that sort of thing. One thing that I think kind of went under the radar a little bit and should have been a bit more in the news, in my opinion, is part of Iran's response to these threats of U.S. military intervention was to test their first intercontinental ballistic missile. And these are long range. Supposedly, the range of an intercontinental ballistic missile is enough that you can cross an ocean with this ballistic missile. Their claim is that this one is not only capable of reaching Europe, but also the east coast of the United States. So imagine for a moment that Iran were to put together some sort of dirty weapon, which there are some accusations that they may have used during the war last year, not a nuclear weapon, but a dirty weapon of some kind, a chemical weapon or something like that. And you put that on a ballistic missile, and then now, theoretically, Iran has the ability to hit New York or DC with a ballistic missile if they can get it past our missile defense systems. I'm not overly concerned about that because the United States has excellent air defense systems, generally speaking, but Iran is clearly trying to shift the whole board on which the game is being played. The terms, the rules of the game, the position of the pieces on the board, the strategy. I mean, it's a pretty significant thing for them to do to claim that they have a missile that can hit the United States. So it doesn't appear as if they're very open to negotiation or moderation right now. If anything, they're getting even a little bit more extreme and sort of dug in on their position, both in terms of what they're threatening to do to the United States, but also what they have not just threatened, but actually done to their own people. So it's really pretty remarkable. If you look at what happened even just this week, you had this drone. You had a Shahed 139, which is the drone that Iran's been producing, works pretty well. They've also been exporting it to other countries around the world as well, who have been using it as a kamikaze drone to devastating effect in their own conflicts, Russia being a good example of this in Ukraine. And they launched this drone, which somehow made its way 500 miles off the coast of Iran, and the news reports are that it, quote unquote, acted aggressively towards the USS Abraham Lincoln, which is an aircraft carrier in the Arabian Sea right now. That's crazy to be launching what is, they can be fitted for reconnaissance purposes, but the primary design and use of a Shahed 139 is it's a kamikaze drone. It's a one-way drone. It doesn't come back. You send it out with explosives, you fly it into something, and it's a suicide drone. And that is, I think, just a remarkable turn of events that things, again, do not appear to be de-escalating, but if anything, are escalating faster. And it would seem that even though Trump did not immediately carry out his threat of military action, if Iran continues to act in this way, it's hard to imagine a world in which it doesn't end in military conflict of some kind, either because Iran instigates it or because Iran fails to negotiate favorable terms and give up its support for terrorism against the Middle East and its own people, and then the US feels like it is compelled to respond. I think it's a lot going on, but something that we should hopefully be paying a lot of attention to still.
Yeah, and
Sebastian, you have
reportedly, I
any
saw
reactions to that?
yeah, I saw some news reports that the president was not happy about this drone incident. It was like a harassment of U.S. naval
Yeah.
equipment. So they're supposed to talk on Friday. So he has not called them off. I really, there are things that we don't know. There are things that the president knows that we don't. That Israel, for instance, has provided them with intelligence. Head of Israeli intelligence, something at the IDF, has been in Washington a lot lately. So I just want to say this. I think, unfortunately, for President Trump, history will judge him by the decision that he makes in the next few weeks about this, or the next few days even, because we all remember Obama's famous red line in Syria. Obama, when Syria started attacking its own citizens with chemical weapons, he said, my red line is chemical weapons. And it was demonstrated that that Syria was using chemical weapons against its own citizens, and he didn't do anything about it. So he was called out. He was a bluff. Now President Trump has said his first warning is, don't shoot protesters, don't kill people. And apparently he was told, like, oh, they're not going to kill them anymore. But it's been demonstrated that they continue to do this. Yeah. So they cross his red line, and he needs to make a decision because China is watching, and China and Taiwan is the next big thing. I think the President Trump needs to set a precedent like he did last time when he gave them a deadline. I'll give you 2 months to negotiate, I think it was. And when the deadline passed, he sent those B 2 bombers to Fordo and other areas. So, and then the second thing I wanted to comment, Josiah, is just friends, Christian friends. Let us acknowledge how destructive this sickness of Islamic jihadism is. This is a wonderful country. This is beautiful people, smart, super capable, very inventive. This country was thriving. It was a friend to the West, friend to the United States. They were very rich. They had a lot of oil. And this Ayatollah guy, Khamenei, destroyed this country with his ideology. They're broke. They don't have water. They don't have electricity. They're freezing in the winter. People are starving. Their country, they cannot do business with anybody because of sanction. And all they have to do is give out this obsession with destroying Israel, destroying America, and destroying the West, financing terrorism. Imagine all these. Let's take El Salvador, for instance. This is a very poor country, or used to be at least, with not a lot of tools in their tool bag. They would have loved to have some natural resource, some geographic location to like exploit. Like there are countries who really want to get ahead in the world, but they can't because they just don't have the tools to do so. But Iran has all going for it, but they just won't let go of this Islamic sickness. And I'm just talking here from a Christian perspective. We know that this is a theology of destruction, a theology of destroying its own people, obsession with war and terror. So let us pray for the sake of the Iranian people. And by the way, we haven't talked about this. Allegedly, I've seen reports of the church growing, exploding, people becoming Christians in this country, at the underground church in Iran. So let us hope that they will be free from the shackle of this destructive mentality that is jihadism, Islamic jihad.
Yeah, I think to your point, Sebastian, there's a lot there that we can be praying for, certainly. I think it's really remarkable how fast the church was growing in Iran even before all of this started. And now it's not just the Christians, but large numbers of dissident networks that have to go underground because of the violence on the streets. There's a lot of danger that the Christians, unfortunately, sort of used to in Iran, but is now even more severe. And we can be praying, of course, for them and their ability to just be a witness to their neighbors about how to suffer well in moments like this and think through how you live in a world like that. So I think there's an opportunity there for many Christians in terms of how they stand out among their neighbors. There's a few things I wanted to mention as far as some of my reactions as well to these stories, as well as sort of what you said. First things first, there's a danger in moving on too quickly from what happened to the protesters. I think there hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to them, and that is very tragic because it was incredibly evil what happened to the protesters. I don't necessarily want to throw the administration under the bus and say that they made a horrible mistake by not immediately launching airstrikes because there's complex variables that go into making military decisions of that magnitude. Part of it is the cost. Part of it also is the question of what can you realistically do. And I've heard a fair amount of commentary in the last couple of weeks suggesting that even if we'd launched massive airstrikes, that doesn't necessarily mean that the protest would have succeeded. More likely, more realistically, it would have also forced many of the protesters on the ground the same way that the regime did, because people aren't going to go out in the streets in the millions if they think they need to stay close to a bomb shelter. And that's just kind of the way it is. It's unfortunate part of reality is that there's only so much that you can do from the outside to influence the outcome of what's happening on the streets in Iran. And we have to be pragmatic about that. What I think is a bit more urgent is not second guessing, could we have done something to help the protest along, but to answer the question, okay, what now? What is the reaction of the world going to be right now as it relates to these protests? It feels like a pretty unique moment in American foreign policy because prior to what happened in Venezuela, for example, most of the discourse was pretty black and white. You had two options. You could do nothing, or you could just storm the gates and force regime change to happen and depose the Islamic Revolution in Iran, that sort of thing. Now, both as a result of shifts in American foreign policy and these new documents that are coming out, like the National Security Strategy document, that sort of thing. There's a third option that's kind of being put on the table, and that is basically regime alteration, as it's being called, as opposed to regime change. Kind of feels like splitting hairs, but basically what that means is maybe we don't take out everyone in the regime. Maybe we take out the Ayatollah. We find someone else inside the regime who's willing to reform, moderate, and basically be a partner to the United States and commit to better governance and not shooting people in the streets. Maybe we work with them so we don't have to bring down the whole system and cause a bunch of chaos in the process. It's interesting. I mean, it's not really something that has been discussed a lot in terms of the conversation within American foreign policy circles, but it does seem to be a method that the President Trump prefers, and the kind of method that honestly is going to make people on both sides of the aisle mad. People on both sides of this debate, both the non-interventionists and the more pro-interventionists, are going to be disappointed by this third way, but it seems to be kind of where President Trump is leaning as his sort of preferred strategy. And again, I'm just basing this on what happened in Venezuela. If you try to translate it, you're comparing apples and oranges a little bit. If you translate the lessons of Venezuela to what he might try to do in Iran, it's worth noting that the outcome might not be what anyone expects. A third option that just has been kind of not on the table or not openly discussed leading up to this moment in American foreign policy. The last thing I'll note is that if something in Iran does change, regional dominoes would fall very quickly. I think the hesitance by Iran's traditional rivals in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, for example, is a dead giveaway that a change in Iran would have wide ranging impacts. Probably one of the reasons why they're not super pro American military intervention and regime decapitation in Iran is that the current setup kind of works for them. Iran's just chaotic enough internally that it doesn't have the necessary capacity to pose a direct threat to Saudi Arabia right now. And they probably kind of like it that way, honestly. So we do have to think about, okay, depending on what option we choose, I think we need to do something. Depending on what option we choose, we have to think about what are the second and third order consequences? What are the downstream impacts of whatever path is chosen in terms of what it does to regional power dynamics and rivalries and competitions right now? You're seeing already some anticipation of this, I think, unfolding and having immediate consequences. Saudi Arabia and Turkey getting closer together, farther away from the UAE, which has kind of chosen Israel as one of its allies in the Middle East. That is not insignificant. And maybe it means that normalization, expansion of the Abraham Accords, if Iran falls, is actually a little bit further away because the lines of competition, the teams that are being chosen or selected for competition, to use a playground analogy, it changes if Iran's no longer part of the equation. And those are the kinds of things that 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, if something dramatic happens in Iran, we'll have to deal with and rethink how we understand the Middle East and potential to create alliances and networks within the Middle East. So lots to think about, but I think the most urgent question is, okay, what now? Now that what's done is done as far as the protesters, I'm honestly not sure that they could have been saved. How are we going to respond? How are we going to ensure that there is some justice for them and not a repeat of that incident? I think that's a pressing question on everyone's mind right now. And in the administration, I think they're having a lot of conversations and meetings about it as they should.
Well, it's a fascinating time to see the Middle East change before our eyes. So I'm so glad that we have this podcast going on. If you guys have any comments or any questions, let us know. Any reactions, anything you guys want us to cover, let us know in the comments. Also, I just want to give a shout out. We have another podcast currently being released, the Discover Your Roots. Really a great, spiritually uplifting content. So as you are staying in touch with us, please do engage with the other podcast because it's also a great work of labor. So Josiah, thank you so much for catching us up. We'll keep watching. We're not going anywhere. Let's see what happens in Iran in the next week, what happens in Israel, in Gaza. I want to thank our producer, Lindsay, for always taking care of us, making sure this podcast happened. Josiah, any last words before we go?
No, just that it's been good to be back with you, Sebastian. Good to be back with our listeners, and look forward to many more conversations about this over the coming weeks.
Yeah, friend, let us be in prayer for the Iranian people, for the church, that they will be a good witness, that they will bring strength and hope to people. I think people are made in the image of God, and freedom is at the core of that. Individual freedom, free will. Even the Lord who made us gave us free will. And the importance that people have a right to pursue freedom, liberty, self-governance. It's one of the gifts of God. So let us pray for the people around. Let's pray for the people of Israel. It's great to be back. We'll see you guys next week in the Passages Pulse. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.